Millionaire takes daughter to the park, but a beggar's shocking words change their lives forever. A millionaire thought he was simply spending a quiet afternoon with his daughter in the park. But everything changed when a ragged, young beggar approached and, with urgency in her voice, declared, "She's my twin sister." The revelation would force him to confront a past he'd never known. The sun shone brightly over Zilker Metropolitan Park, casting warmth across the trails and creating inviting patches of shade beneath the trees. Ethan Parker sat on a bench, watching his daughter Sophie as she darted toward the playground. It was rare for him to take a break from work for outings like this, but the smile on her face made it worthwhile. Ethan glanced at his phone, half focused on emails, until a sharp cry pierced the air. He looked up and saw Sophie standing still, her face filled with curiosity. Beside her stood a frail-looking girl, her clothes worn and her hair a tangled mess. Ethan felt a surge of unease and immediately started walking toward them. "You're my sister," the girl declared, her voice unwavering despite her appearance. Sophie blinked in confusion, unsure how to respond. Ethan reached them in moments, positioning himself protectively in front of Sophie. "Who are you? What's going on here?" he asked, his tone steady but firm. The girl didn't flinch. "My name is Maya. She's my sister." "I know it." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. There was a certainty in the girl's tone that unsettled him. He pulled Sophie gently by the hand and began leading her away, his mind racing. Who was this girl, and why would she say something so absurd? As they walked back to the car, he glanced over his shoulder and saw Maya still standing there, watching them, her eyes locked on Sophie. Back in the car, the silence between them was almost palpable. Sophie sat in the back seat, clutching a stuffed animal Ethan had bought her earlier that morning. She finally broke the quiet with a question, her voice soft yet curious. "Dad, do you think what that girl said could be true? Could I really have a sister?" Ethan exhaled sharply, his grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "Sophie, that girl was probably just confused. You don't need to worry about what she said." He glanced at her reflection in the rear-view mirror, hoping the explanation would put an end to her questions. But Sophie's thoughtful expression showed otherwise. She looked so sure, though. And the way she looked at me, it felt strange. Ethan couldn't deny the unsettling certainty in Maya's words and the way she had stared at Sophie. Shaking off the thought, he replied, "Sometimes people say things because they're going through hard times. That girl seemed like she needed help, but that doesn't mean she's your sister." Sophie nodded slowly, but the lingering spark of doubt in her eyes was impossible to miss. At home, Ethan watched as Sophie sat quietly at the dining table, drawing on a piece of paper. When she showed him the picture, his chest tightened. It was a simple sketch of two girls holding hands under a shining sun. He swallowed hard, unable to shake the unease that had settled in since they left the park. That evening, Ethan sat in his home office, staring at his computer screen. His thoughts were miles away from the reports and emails demanding his attention. Instead, they circled back to the strange encounter at the park. Maya's words, clear and confident, played on repeat in his mind. Her resemblance to Sophie was uncanny, too striking to ignore. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the framed photo of his late wife, Emily. It had been 8 years since he lost her during Sophie's birth. The grief had driven him to pour every ounce of his energy into work, leaving little room for introspection or memories of the past. Ethan opened the file containing Sophie's birth records. Everything seemed ordinary at first glance, dates, times, and routine medical notes. But something gnawed at him. He remembered the chaos of that day, the rushed voices of doctors, the beeping of machines, and the devastating news of Emily's passing. Had he missed something important in the aftermath? Closing the file, Ethan shook his head. The idea of a second child seemed absurd. Yet, he couldn't forget the certainty in Maya's voice or the look in her eyes. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the growing unease. "It's a coincidence," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But deep down, he wasn't sure he believed it. The next afternoon, Ethan left his office building, engrossed in a phone call. As he approached his car, a voice called out, "Mr. Parker." He turned sharply and froze. Maya was standing near the sidewalk, clutching a worn backpack. "How did you find me?" Ethan asked, his tone edged with irritation. Maya took a cautious step forward. "I've been waiting for you. I need to talk to you about Sophie." Ethan scanned the area, conscious of the onlookers nearby. "Maya, this isn't the time or place for this," he said, trying to maintain composure. But the girl's determination didn't waver. "I'm not lying. I know she's my sister. You just have to listen." Ethan's frustration boiled over. "You can't just follow me around like this. Do you understand how serious this could be?" Maya's gaze didn't falter. "I don't want anything from you. I just need you to believe me." Ethan hesitated, her sincerity catching him off guard. Before he could respond, she pulled something from her backpack, a small, tattered photo of herself as a baby. Ethan froze as he studied the picture. Something about it stirred a memory he couldn't quite place. "I'll leave if you want," Maya said quietly. "But I'm telling the truth." Ethan stood there, conflicted, as she turned and walked away. Ethan sat at the dining table, the tattered baby photo Maya had handed him resting in front of him. The edges were frayed, the colors faded, but the details were unmistakable. The baby in the picture bore an uncanny resemblance to Sophie at that age. He had tried to dismiss the encounter as another strange coincidence, but this photo had shifted something inside him. Sophie wandered into the room, holding her stuffed animal. She climbed into the chair beside him, her curious eyes immediately catching sight of the picture. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing at the photo. Ethan hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "It's just someone I met today," he replied vaguely. Sophie tilted her head, studying the image closely. "She looks like me when I was little." Her innocent observation made Ethan's chest tighten. "Why don't we meet her again?" she asked. Ethan forced a smile and ruffled her hair. "We'll see, kiddo." After putting Sophie to bed, Ethan returned to his office and reopened Sophie's birth records. This time, he noticed something odd, a single missing document in the hospital's discharge paperwork. It wasn't definitive proof of anything, but it planted a seed of doubt. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Maya's words and the photo swirled in his mind. Could there really be something he had overlooked all these years? The thought was unsettling, but impossible to ignore. Determined to get answers, Ethan called the hospital the next morning. "I'd like access to the complete records from my daughter's birth," he requested. The receptionist's voice on the other end was polite but firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but those records are archived and not readily accessible." Ethan frowned. "I'm her father. I have every right to see them." The receptionist paused before replying. "You'll need to submit a formal request and wait for approval. It could take several weeks." Frustrated, Ethan ended the call and stared at his phone. Weeks? He didn't have that kind of time. Not with Maya pressing for answers and Sophie becoming more curious by the day. He decided to take matters into his own hands. That afternoon, Ethan visited the hospital in person, hoping to bypass the bureaucracy. At the records department, a young clerk gave him the same rehearsed response. Only authorized personnel can access archive files without proper clearance. Ethan's patience wore thin. "Listen, I just need one missing document. It's important." The clerk hesitated, clearly intimidated by Ethan's intensity, but eventually shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir. That's not how it works." Leaving the hospital, Ethan felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The more resistance he encountered, the more convinced he became that something was being hidden, and if the system wouldn't cooperate, he'd have to find another way. Ethan sat in his office, poring over the hospital's limited records, frustration mounting. The missing document loomed like a puzzle piece just out of reach. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Ryan Mitchell His longtime business partner and closest friend, stepped in, holding a cup of coffee. "Everything okay?" Ryan asked, settling into the chair across from Ethan. His sharp eyes scanned the cluttered desk, landing on the hospital file. "What's this?" Ethan hesitated before explaining. He recounted his encounter with Maya and the doubts that had surfaced since. Ryan listened intently but frowned as Ethan finished. "You're seriously entertaining this idea? A random girl shows up claiming to be Sophie's sister, and you're chasing hospital records." "It's not random," Ethan replied sharply. "There are inconsistencies. Things don't add up." Ryan leaned back, his skepticism evident. "Look, I get it. Losing Emily was hard, and Sophie means the world to you. But you can't let this derail your life or the company. If word gets out that you're involved in some scandal like this, it could hurt us both." Ethan's jaw tightened. "This isn't about the company. It's about the truth." Ryan sighed. "I'm just saying, tread carefully. Sometimes, digging too deep into the past only brings pain." Ethan nodded, but Ryan's words lingered as the door closed behind him. Pain or not, Ethan knew he couldn't ignore what was unfolding. That evening, Ethan decided to meet Maya. He found her near the same park bench where they'd first crossed paths. She was sitting alone, clutching the same worn backpack. "You came," she said, her voice laced with cautious hope. Ethan sat down, keeping his tone measured. "I need to know everything you remember about your life." Maya hesitated, her fingers fiddling with the straps of her bag. "It's not much," she admitted. "I've been on my own for a long time, but I remember the hospital. The nurses used to call me Baby B." Ethan's breath caught. Baby B? It was standard terminology for twins during childbirth. Maya continued, "I don't know why, but I always felt like I had someone out there. Someone like me." Ethan's mind raced. The missing document, the inconsistencies, the photo. Everything seemed to align, but there was still so much he didn't know. "Do you have anything else? Anything that might help?" Maya reached into her bag and pulled out a faded hospital bracelet. The name had partially rubbed off, but the birth date was clear. The same as Sophie's. Ethan stared at it, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. "Maya," he said slowly, "if what you're saying is true, then we need to figure out what happened." Maya nodded, her eyes reflecting a mix of hope and fear. For the first time, Ethan felt that same mix within himself. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself unable to focus on work. His thoughts were consumed by Maya's story, the hospital bracelet, and the implications of her claim. Despite his initial doubts, he couldn't deny the mounting evidence. But one question lingered. How would Sophie feel about all this? One evening, as Sophie worked on a puzzle at the dining table, Ethan sat across from her. "Sophie," he began cautiously, "how would you feel if you had a sister?" Sophie's eyes lit up instantly. "A sister? Like Maya?" Her tone was filled with excitement rather than confusion. Ethan was taken aback. "You like Maya?" he asked. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "She's nice, and she looks like me. I think we could be good friends." Her innocent response tugged at Ethan's heart. Sophie had always been an only child, and while he tried to give her everything she needed, perhaps something had been missing. He realized that Sophie's acceptance of Maya was far less complicated than his own. The next day, Ethan arranged for Maya to visit their home. Sophie greeted her warmly, immediately dragging her to the living room to play. Ethan observed from the kitchen, grappling with the surreal sight of the two girls together. For the first time, the idea of Maya being part of their family didn't seem so far-fetched. But as the girls laughed and played, Ethan knew he couldn't ignore the unanswered questions. The truth, whatever it was, had to be uncovered. Determined to get closer to the truth, Ethan decided to reach out to someone who might help. A former nurse at the hospital named Linda, who had worked the night Sophie was born. Her name had appeared in the limited records he'd managed to access. Tracking her down took time, but he eventually found her contact information. That evening, he gave her a call. "Ms. Linda, my name is Ethan Parker. I'm looking into some questions about my daughter's birth at St. Mary's Hospital 8 years ago. I was told you were on staff that night." There was a pause on the line. "Why now, after all this time?" Linda asked, her tone cautious. Ethan chose his words carefully. "Something has come up. A child who claims to be Sophie's twin. I need to know if there's any truth to this." Linda's sharp intake of breath was audible. "You shouldn't be calling me," she said quickly. "I can't discuss anything about that night." "Please," Ethan insisted. "I just need answers. This is about my family." There was another long silence. Finally, Linda spoke, her voice trembling. "If you want answers, you're looking in the right place. But you need to be careful. There are people who don't want this story coming out." Before Ethan could press further, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, the weight of her warning settling over him like a storm cloud. The weight of Linda's warning lingered in Ethan's mind, but he couldn't let it deter him. The clues were mounting, and the next logical step was undeniable: a DNA test. It was the only way to confirm whether Maya was truly Sophie's sister. The following morning, Ethan picked Maya up and took her to a private clinic. "Are you sure this will work?" Maya asked as they walked into the sterile waiting room. Ethan nodded, his voice calm but firm. "This will give us answers. No more doubts." The nurse collected samples from both Maya and Sophie, who tagged along with her usual curiosity. Sophie didn't fully understand the gravity of the test, but she seemed excited to be part of the process. "Does this mean Maya might stay with us?" she asked brightly. Ethan hesitated, his gaze shifting between the two girls. "We'll see," he replied, unsure of how to manage her growing expectations. The test results would take a few days, but those days felt like an eternity to Ethan. He couldn't help but replay every detail of his encounters with Maya, every inconsistency in the hospital records. The nagging thought that something had been deliberately hidden grew stronger. Back home, Ethan watched Sophie and Maya playing in the backyard. Despite the tension gnawing at him, he couldn't deny the natural bond forming between them. Whatever the test revealed, it was clear that the connection Maya felt with Sophie wasn't just one-sided. The wait for the DNA results was excruciating. Ethan kept himself busy at work, but his focus wavered constantly. The stakes felt higher than ever, and every passing hour added to his unease. Meanwhile, Maya seemed lighter, more at ease. She spent her days with Sophie, quickly learning the rhythm of the Parker household. Ethan couldn't help but notice how naturally Maya fit in. It was as if she'd been part of their lives all along. One evening, as the girls played board games, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a text from Linda. "We need to talk. Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. coffee shop on 5th Avenue. The cryptic message unsettled him, but it also reignited his determination. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the coffee shop early, scanning the room nervously. Linda appeared minutes later, her face lined with stress. "You shouldn't have pushed this," she said as she slid into the seat across from him. "What do you know about that night?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice steady. Linda hesitated, looking around as if expecting someone to be watching. "There were 2 babies," she finally admitted. "But I wasn't supposed to say anything. Orders came from above." Ethan's heart raced. Why would they hide this? Linda leaned closer, her voice a whisper. "Because there's money in it. And people who benefit from babies disappearing don't like questions." Before Ethan could respond, Linda abruptly stood up. "Be careful, Mr. Parker. You've stirred up something dangerous." Ethan sat in his car outside the coffee shop, Linda's words echoing in his mind. There were 2 babies. The confirmation hit him like a tidal wave. For years, he had believed Sophie was his only child. Now, that certainty was unraveling, replaced by the chilling reality of corruption and deceit. Driving home, Ethan felt the weight of the decision ahead. Should he pursue this further, potentially putting his family at risk, or let it go and preserve their fragile sense of normalcy. As he parked, he caught sight of Sophie and Maya playing in the yard, their laughter drifting through the open window. The sight bolstered his resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore. That evening, Sophie approached him at dinner. "When will we know?" she asked, her eyes wide with anticipation. Ethan hesitated before replying. "Soon, sweetheart. We'll know soon." Maya stayed quiet, but the hope in her expression was unmistakable. Later, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at his phone. The test results would arrive tomorrow. The thought both terrified and excited him. If Maya truly was Sophie's twin, it would change everything. But if she wasn't, how would he break it to the girls? As the night wore on, Ethan found himself pacing the room, the enormity of what he might uncover keeping him awake. He knew one thing for certain. Once the results were in, there would be no turning back. The next morning, Ethan's phone buzzed with an email notification. His hands trembled as he opened it, the subject line glaring back at him. DNA test results, confidential. He sat down, heart pounding, and clicked the file. As his eyes scanned the text, the world seemed to shift around him. Maya and Sophie shared a 99.9% genetic match. They were, without question, twins. Ethan leaned back, the breath leaving his lungs in a rush. He had suspected it, but seeing the truth in black and white was overwhelming. His thoughts raced. How had this happened? Why had Maya been separated from them? And, more importantly, who was responsible? The sound of Sophie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Dad, did you get the results?" she asked, peeking into the room. Maya stood behind her, hesitant but hopeful. Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, Maya, you're Sophie's sister." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Sophie ran to Maya, throwing her arms around her in a hug. "I knew it!" she exclaimed. Maya, stunned, hugged her back, tears streaming down her face. Ethan watched the scene, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. While the girls celebrated, he knew the real battle was just beginning. The truth was out, but the questions surrounding it remained. And Ethan was determined to find the answers, no matter the cost. Ethan sat in the living room, watching Sophie and Maya play with their dolls as if they'd known each other forever. Their bond had formed effortlessly, an unspoken connection that only deepened after the DNA results confirmed their sisterhood. The sight filled him with equal parts joy and determination. Maya deserved the same security and love Sophie had always known. As the girls laughed, Ethan's mind churned with questions. How had this happened? Why had no one told him about Maya's existence? He knew the answers lay in the hospital and the people who had hidden the truth. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Ryan. "You've been quiet," Ryan said when Ethan picked up. "Any updates?" Ethan hesitated. Ryan had been wary of this investigation from the start, and while Ethan trusted him, he wasn't ready to share everything. "Still piecing things together," he replied vaguely. Ryan sighed. "Just remember, the longer this drags on, the more risk it brings to you, Sophie, and the company. Be careful." After the call, Ethan sat back, his resolve hardening. Risk or not, he couldn't ignore this. He looked at Maya, now engrossed in Sophie's storytelling. She was no longer just a stranger in their lives. She was family. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd start digging deeper. He had questions, and someone at St. Mary's Hospital had the answers. The next morning, Ethan arrived at St. Mary's Hospital, his focus unwavering. He bypassed the main desk, heading directly to the records department. The same clerk who had refused him access before was there, her expression cautious as he approached. "I need access to the full records from 8 years ago," Ethan said firmly. The clerk shook her head, already prepared with the standard response. "I told you before, Mr. Parker, those files are archived, without proper authorization." "I'm not leaving without them," Ethan interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Call whoever you need, but I need those records today." The clerk hesitated, glancing around nervously. Finally, she picked up the phone and made a call. Ethan strained to hear the muffled conversation, but the words higher clearance and special request stood out. She hung up and turned back to him. Someone will come down to speak with you. Minutes later, a man in a sharp suit arrived. Mr. Parker, I'm Greg Thompson, the hospital administrator. I understand you're looking for some records. Ethan extended his hand, masking his unease. That's right. My daughter's birth records are incomplete. I need the missing documents. Greg's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'll look into this personally, but these things take time. Bureaucracy, you know. Ethan didn't miss the subtle warning in his tone. As Greg walked away, Ethan felt the first ripple of resistance. Someone didn't want him digging, and that only made him more determined. Ethan left St. Mary's Hospital with Greg Thompson's words echoing in his mind. These things take time. The polite dismissal was meant to deter him, but it only fueled his determination. He knew he needed someone on the inside to uncover the truth. Linda's warning about danger hadn't stopped him, and now he had to lean on her for more. That evening, Ethan called Linda again. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. There was a long pause before she answered. "I already told you everything I could." "Not enough," Ethan insisted. "Greg Thompson is stonewalling me. If I don't act now, this will stay buried." Reluctantly, Linda agreed to meet him at a diner on the outskirts of town. Over steaming cups of coffee, she avoided his gaze. "You're playing with fire, Mr. Parker," she warned. "Greg isn't just some administrator. He has connections, powerful ones." "What happened that night, Linda?" Ethan pressed. Her hands trembled as she recounted fragments of the past. "There were 2 babies," she said quietly. "But when Emily didn't make it, the second baby, Maya, was listed as stillborn. It wasn't true, but they didn't expect anyone to question it." Ethan's stomach churned. Why would they do that? Linda hesitated before whispering. "Because someone paid them to." Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Who?" But before she could answer, Linda glanced nervously toward the door and lowered her voice. "They're watching." Ethan returned home late, his mind racing. Linda's cryptic warning had confirmed his fears. This wasn't just negligence. It was corruption orchestrated and deliberate. Someone had stolen Maya from him, and they weren't going to give up the truth without a fight. The next morning, Ethan called Ryan, deciding to share part of what he'd learned. "This isn't just about missing records," Ethan said. "There's something bigger. Someone intentionally hid Maya." Ryan's silence on the other end of the line was unnerving. Finally, he said, "Ethan, I get that this is personal, but you're dragging us into dangerous territory. If this explodes, it'll hurt everyone, including Sophie." Ethan clenched his jaw. "This isn't about the company, Ryan. It's about doing the right thing." Ryan sighed heavily. "Just remember, if you go too far, you might not be able to pull yourself back." Later that day, Ethan received an unexpected email. "We know what you're looking for. Drop it, or your family will pay the price." The word sent a cold chill down his spine. He checked the sender, but it was from an anonymous account. He stared at the screen, his chest tightening. Whoever they were watching, and they were ready to strike. Ethan closed the laptop, his determination unshaken. The stakes were higher now, but he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. Maya deserved justice, and Ethan was ready to face whatever came next. The anonymous email weighed heavily on Ethan's mind as he stared at his laptop screen. The words were clear. "Drop it, or your family will pay the price." His initial instinct was to dismiss it as a scare tactic, but the stakes were too high to ignore. Whoever had sent it knew what he was uncovering, and they were watching. Ethan forwarded the email to a trusted IT specialist, asking for help tracking its source. The reply came quickly. The email was routed through several servers. "It's impossible to trace without more data." Frustrated, Ethan closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. Someone wanted him to back off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was closer than he realized. At dinner, he struggled to mask his unease. Sophie, oblivious to the tension, chatted animatedly with Maya about their day. Maya, however, seemed more reserved. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Sophie asked, her voice cutting through Ethan's thoughts. He forced a smile. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Eat your vegetables." Maya watched him carefully, her perceptiveness evident. Later, as the girls played, she approached Ethan quietly. "They're trying to scare you, aren't they?" she asked. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "It's nothing for you to worry about." Maya's expression hardened. "They've been scaring me my whole life. Don't let them win." Her words lit a fire in Ethan. If Maya could endure so much and still stand strong, so could he. The email wasn't a deterrent. It was a challenge. And Ethan wasn't backing down. Determined to push forward, Ethan contacted a private investigator the next morning. If the hospital wouldn't give him answers, he'd find another way. "I need someone who can look into St. Mary's," he told the investigator, a seasoned professional named Karen Ross. "The records from 8 years ago, particularly any discrepancies in births." Karen listened intently before replying. "Hospitals don't just lose records. If something's missing, someone wanted it gone. I'll dig around and see what I find." As Karen began her investigation, Ethan turned his focus back to the anonymous email. He reached out to Ryan, hoping for advice. "Someone's trying to scare me off," Ethan admitted, his voice low. "I got a threat." Ryan's reaction was immediate. "This has gone too far, Ethan. You're putting yourself and Sophie in danger." "I can't stop now," Ethan replied firmly. "I owe it to Maya." Ryan sighed heavily. "Just be careful. And if you need help, don't hesitate to call me." That evening, Karen updated Ethan with her first findings. "There's definitely something unusual. Multiple births recorded that night, but one of the files was flagged as restricted access. It's not normal for a file like that to be locked without a court order." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Can you get into it?" Karen hesitated. "I'll need time, and if anyone's watching, they'll notice when I do." Ethan nodded. "Do whatever it takes." The deeper he went, the more dangerous it became. But Ethan knew he was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Karen's findings consumed Ethan's thoughts as he prepared for the day. The revelation about the restricted file confirmed his suspicions. Someone at St. Mary's Hospital had deliberately hidden the truth. But why? And for how long? Later that evening, Karen called. Her voice was cautious, almost hushed. "I managed to access part of the file. It confirms what you suspected. There were 2 babies born that night. Both were listed as healthy until the second was marked stillborn in a separate report." Ethan's heart sank. "What else did you find?" Karen hesitated. "The attending doctor signed off on the report, but his name doesn't appear in any other records from that night. It's like he vanished." Ethan felt a cold dread settle over him. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. "Can you find this doctor?" "I'll try," Karen said. "But Ethan, you should know. People don't erase themselves from records unless they have something to hide. Be careful." Ethan thanked her and ended the call, his mind racing. He looked toward the living room where Sophie and Maya sat, giggling over a board game. The sight filled him with a renewed sense of urgency. Whatever danger lay ahead, he had to face it. For them. But as the night wore on, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Whoever had orchestrated this cover-up wouldn't stay silent much longer. The next day, Ethan received an email from an unknown sender. "I know what you're looking for. Meet me tonight. Coffee shop on 3rd at 8 p.m. Against his better judgment, Ethan decided to go. He arrived at the small, dimly lit cafe and scanned the room. A woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes and a nervous demeanor waved him over. "You're Ethan Parker," she said as he sat down. "My name's Rachel. I used to work at St. Mary's." Ethan leaned forward, his pulse quickening. What do you know? Rachel glanced around nervously before speaking in a low voice. I was there the night your wife gave birth. The second baby, Maya, wasn't stillborn. She was taken. Ethan's stomach churned. Taken by who? Rachel hesitated, her hands trembling. It was part of a program. Babies were sold to families willing to pay. It wasn't just Maya. There were others. Ethan felt a surge of anger and disbelief. Why are you telling me this now? Because I couldn't live with the guilt anymore, Rachel admitted. But you need to be careful. Greg Thompson was involved. If he knows you're onto him, he'll come after you. Ethan's jaw tightened. Rachel's words confirmed his worst fears. He wasn't just uncovering Maya's story. He was exposing a system built on greed and corruption. And now, Greg Thompson knew he was closing in. Ethan drove home in silence, Rachel's words echoing in his mind. Babies sold to families. Maya wasn't just a mistake or a cover-up. She was part of something far more sinister. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he thought of Greg Thompson. The man had been too composed during their last encounter, a facade of control masking something far darker. At home, Sophie and Maya greeted him with their usual warmth. He forced a smile, but Maya's perceptive gaze lingered on him longer than usual. Are you okay? She asked quietly. Ethan hesitated. I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind. Later that evening, as the girls slept, Ethan sat in his office, trying to piece together everything he'd learned. The restricted hospital records, the missing doctor, Rachel's confession. It all pointed to a coordinated effort to profit off vulnerable families. But why had Maya been taken? And why had she been left to fend for herself, while Sophie lived a life of privilege? His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp ping from his phone. A new email appeared with no subject line and an attachment. The sender was anonymous. Opening it cautiously, Ethan found a series of scanned documents, financial records tied to St. Mary's Hospital. The sums were astronomical, with names he didn't recognize, but one name stood out: Greg Thompson. Ethan's pulse quickened. The email confirmed Rachel's story and exposed Greg's direct involvement. But who had sent it? And why now? The next morning, Ethan arrived at his office to find Ryan waiting, his expression tense. We need to talk, Ryan said, closing the door behind them. I got a call from Greg Thompson this morning. He knows you're digging. Ethan froze. What did he say? Ryan shook his head. He didn't give details, but he's furious. He implied that whatever you're doing could bring legal trouble for you and the company. Ethan felt his anger boil. Legal trouble? He's the one stealing children and selling them to the highest bidder. Ryan's eyes widened. Do you have proof? Ethan hesitated before showing Ryan the financial records. These were sent to me anonymously. They tied Greg directly to the hospital's corruption. Ryan's face darkened as he scanned the documents. This is explosive. But Ethan, if Greg knows you have this, he'll do everything in his power to shut you down. I'm not backing down, Ethan said firmly. He took Maya from me, from Sophie. I can't ignore that. Ryan sighed. Then we need to be smart about this. If you go public without a solid plan, Greg will destroy you. Let's gather everything we can first. Ethan nodded reluctantly. He appreciated Ryan's caution, but his patience was wearing thin. Greg's counterattack had begun, and Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated. As Ryan left, Ethan stared at the documents, his resolve hardening. Greg might be coming for him, but Ethan wouldn't stop until the truth was exposed. Ethan spent the next few days preparing for what felt like a battle on all fronts. Ryan's warning about Greg's counterattack lingered in his mind, but the anonymous documents provided him with a path forward. He needed more evidence, something undeniable that would bring Greg and the entire system down. Karen, the private investigator, called with an update. I traced the financial records you sent me, she said. Greg Thompson was laundering money through shell companies linked to private adoption agencies. The scale of this is massive, Ethan. He's not just covering up Maya's case. He's profiting from dozens, maybe hundreds of others. Ethan felt a chill run through him. Can we connect this directly to Maya? Karen hesitated. It's tricky. Her file is locked tight, and without a court order, we can't access it legally. Then find another way, Ethan replied. We need to tie this back to her. Meanwhile, Ethan's home life offered brief moments of reprieve. Sophie and Maya's bond grew stronger each day. Watching them laugh and play reminded Ethan of what he was fighting for. But even in those quiet moments, the weight of the coming confrontation loomed large. That evening, Ethan received another email from the anonymous source. Meet me tomorrow at the warehouse on 12th Street. Come alone. The message was cryptic, but Ethan couldn't ignore it. Whoever was helping him had access to critical information. He had to take the risk. As he stared at the message, Ethan knew this meeting could change everything or end it all. The warehouse on 12th Street was dark and abandoned, its rusted exterior illuminated only by a flickering streetlight. Ethan parked his car nearby and stepped out, his heart pounding. Every instinct told him this was dangerous, but the need for answers pushed him forward. Inside, the air was cold and heavy with dust. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim glow over the room. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man in his early 50s with sharp features and a guarded expression. You're Ethan Parker, the man said. I'm David Clark. I used to work at St. Mary's. Ethan stepped closer, his voice steady but cautious. You sent the documents? David nodded. And there's more where that came from. Greg Thompson isn't just stealing babies. He's running an entire operation. Families desperate for children pay top dollar, and he makes sure no one asks questions. Why are you telling me this now? Ethan demanded. David's face hardened. Because I was part of it. I signed off on false records. I thought I was helping, but I didn't realize the extent of the corruption until it was too late. I've been trying to make it right ever since. Ethan's chest tightened. And Maya? David hesitated. She's one of many. But her case is unique because you're fighting back. He handed Ethan a folder. This is everything you need to prove Greg's involvement. But be careful. If he knows you have this, he won't stop until you're silenced. Ethan took the folder, his resolve hardening. The truth was finally within reach. Ethan drove home, gripping the folder tightly, his mind racing with the implications of what David Clark had revealed. The evidence inside was damning. Financial transactions, falsified records, and internal memos implicating Greg Thompson and others in the adoption scheme. Each piece painted a clearer picture of the corruption at St. Mary's Hospital and the systemic exploitation that had torn Maya from her family. Once home, Ethan locked the folder in his office safe and sat down, his exhaustion finally catching up with him. Sophie and Maya were asleep, their peaceful faces a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in his world. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the battle ahead pressing heavily on him. The next morning, Ryan arrived unannounced, his expression tense. What's going on, Ethan? You've been too quiet, and I know that look, you're about to do something reckless. Ethan hesitated before unlocking the safe and showing Ryan the folder. This is everything I've been working toward. Proof of what Greg has done. This isn't just about Maya anymore. It's about everyone he's hurt. Ryan flipped through the documents, his face hardening with each page. This is huge. But if you go public with this, Greg won't just sit back and take it. Are you ready for that? I have no choice, Ethan replied firmly. This needs to end, and I'm not letting fear stop me. Ryan sighed, recognizing the determination in Ethan's eyes. Then let's make sure you have a plan. You'll need allies if you're going to bring him down. Ethan spent the next day preparing to go public with the evidence. Following Ryan's advice, he reached out to trusted individuals who could support him. Karen Ross, the private investigator, agreed to review the documents for additional leads. Rachel, the former St. Mary's nurse, promised to come forward as a witness, despite her fears of retaliation. Are you sure about this? Rachel asked during a phone call. Once you expose this, there's no going back. I'm sure, Ethan said. Greg can't keep getting away with this. Meanwhile, Ethan met with a journalist from a reputable news outlet, someone Ryan had connected him with discreetly. This story is massive, the journalist said after reviewing the folder. But if we're going to run it, we'll need more than documents. We'll need testimonies, a full picture. I'm working on it, Ethan assured them. But I need this story out as soon as possible. Every day Greg stays in power, more families are at risk. The journalist agreed to begin drafting the story, but their words stuck with Ethan, a full picture. To bring Greg down, Ethan needed to ensure every loose end was tied. That night, he gathered Sophie and Maya in the living room. There's something important I need to do, he told them gently. It's going to change things for all of us, but it's the right thing. Maya looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. You're going to stop him, aren't you? Ethan nodded. Yes, I am. Ethan spent the following morning finalizing his plan to expose Greg Thompson and the corruption at St. Mary's. He reviewed every piece of evidence, ensuring there were no gaps Greg could exploit to deny his involvement. The stakes had never been higher, but Ethan felt an unshakable resolve. This wasn't just about justice for Maya. It was about preventing others from suffering the same fate. Karen called with an update. I've cross-referenced the financial records with adoption agency payments. The pattern is clear. Greg's operation spans across multiple states. This isn't just a local scandal. Can we tie it directly to him? Ethan asked. Yes, Karen confirmed. His signature is on several of the transfers. Ethan contacted the journalist to share the new findings. This is bigger than we thought, he explained. We're ready to go public, but I need you to time this perfectly. We'll release the story tomorrow morning, the journalist assured him. The more prepared we are, the harder it'll be for him to fight back. That evening, Ethan sat with Sophie and Maya, trying to prepare them for what was coming. Things might get tough, he admitted. There are people who won't want this story to come out. Maya met his gaze, her voice steady. We can handle it. As Ethan tucked them in for the night, he felt a surge of pride in Maya's courage and Sophie's unwavering support. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The next morning, Ethan's phone buzzed incessantly. The journalists had kept their word, and the story was live. The headline read, Hospital Scandal Exposed, Illegal Adoptions and Corruption at St. Mary's. The article detailed the entire scheme, naming Greg Thompson as the central figure. It included testimonies from Rachel and David Clark, financial records provided by Karen, and the personal story of Maya's separation from her family. The response was immediate. Social media exploded with outrage, and news outlets began picking up the story. Ethan felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Relief that the truth was out, but anxiety over Greg's inevitable reaction. By mid-afternoon, Ethan received a call from Ryan. Greg's lawyers just released a statement denying everything, Ryan said. They're calling it a smear campaign. Ethan gritted his teeth. Let them deny it. We have the evidence. But Greg wasn't just relying on legal maneuvers. That evening, as Ethan returned home, he noticed a black SUV idling near his driveway. It drove off as soon as he approached, leaving him with an uneasy feeling. Once inside, he checked the locks and security system, determined to protect his family at all costs. Are we safe? Maya asked quietly. Sensing his tension, Ethan knelt down and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Yes, he said firmly. No matter what happens, I'll keep us safe. As the sun set, Ethan knew the battle was far from over. Greg wouldn't go down without a fight. The following day, the fallout from the expose intensified. News channels replayed segments from the article, while social media exploded with demands for accountability. Greg Thompson remained silent, his legal team issuing vague denials and threatening lawsuits. Ethan knew this was only the beginning. By midday, Ethan's office received a subpoena. Greg was suing him for defamation, claiming the accusations were baseless and damaging to his reputation. Ryan burst into Ethan's office, the document in hand. "This is his move, bury you in legal battles." Ethan leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "Let him try. We've got the truth on our side." Ryan wasn't as calm. "Ethan, this isn't just about money. He's sending a message. Back off or he'll destroy everything." Later that evening, Ethan returned home to find a note taped to his front door. "Stop digging or you'll regret it." The message was simple but chilling. He tightened home security and sat with Maya and Sophie, reassuring them that everything would be fine. Yet the unease gnawed at him. Meanwhile, Karen called with a critical update. "Greg's team is scrambling. There's chatter about certain documents they're desperate to retrieve from the hospital." "What kind of documents?" Ethan asked. "Personnel records, financial transfers, things that could connect Greg to higher-ups." Ethan's jaw tightened. Greg was making moves to protect himself, but Ethan wasn't about to back down. "Keep digging," he said. "We're not done yet." Greg's retaliation had begun, but so had the cracks in his armor. Determined to stay ahead of Greg, Ethan devised a plan to retrieve the documents Karen had mentioned. They were key to solidifying the case against him, but time was running out. Greg's team would stop at nothing to destroy any remaining evidence. That night, Ethan met Karen outside the hospital. She had tracked down the location of the archive files Greg was targeting. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as they stood near a side entrance. "This could get messy." Ethan nodded. "We don't have a choice. If we wait, those files will disappear." Using Karen's connections, they gained access to the archives. The room was cold and dimly lit, rows of files stretching endlessly. Karen guided him to the section they needed. "Here," she whispered, pulling out a box labeled with the year Maya and Sophie were born. Ethan's hands shook as he sifted through the contents. Inside were personnel records, financial transactions, and patient logs, all pointing to a coordinated effort to hide illegal adoptions. Karen snapped photos of each document, ensuring they had backups. Footsteps echoed down the hall, and Ethan's heart raced. He motioned for Karen to stay quiet as the sound grew louder. Two voices carried through the space, one unmistakably Greg's. "If these files get out, we're finished," he said. Ethan clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to confront him. As the voices faded, Karen tapped his shoulder. "We've got enough. Let's go." Leaving the hospital, Ethan felt both triumph and dread. The evidence was secure, but the danger was closer than ever. The next morning, as Ethan reviewed the documents they had retrieved from the hospital, he felt the weight of their significance. These were the final pieces of the puzzle. The proof that Greg Thompson had orchestrated a network of illegal adoptions. The financial transfers, the names of accomplices, and the falsified records all pointed directly to him. Ethan knew that with this evidence, he could bring Greg down once and for all. As he prepared to go public with the new findings, he felt a growing unease. The threats were no longer subtle. Greg's legal team had already begun their counterattack, and Ethan had no doubt that the next move would be even more aggressive. It wasn't just his career on the line. It was the safety of his family. Sophie and Maya spent the morning playing in the yard, blissfully unaware of the danger that was closing in. Ethan watched them from the window, his heart heavy with the knowledge that their lives were about to be turned upside down. He had been determined to protect them, but the reality of the fight ahead was settling in. That evening, he met with Ryan to discuss the next steps. "We need to go public and soon," Ethan said. "If we wait any longer, Greg will bury this." Ryan agreed, but his face was etched with concern. "Once we go public, there's no turning back." "Are you ready for the fallout?" Ethan nodded. "I've made my choice. We're doing this." At dawn the next day, Ethan's phone buzzed with an email alert. The story was live. He clicked the link, his pulse racing as he read the headline. "Whistleblower exposes St. Mary's Hospital adoption scandal. Evidence points to Greg Thompson." The article, complete with photos of the documents Karen had taken and interviews with Rachel and David, painted a clear picture of corruption. Greg Thompson was named as the mastermind behind the operation that had trafficked children for profit. The article also included shocking testimonies, detailing how families had been exploited for years. Ethan sat back, a mixture of relief and anxiety flooding him. He had been prepared for the backlash, but nothing could have prepared him for the speed at which the story spread. Within hours, news outlets were calling for statements, and social media was ablaze with outrage. People from all over the country were demanding justice for the children whose lives had been ruined by this scheme. But as Ethan followed the coverage, he knew the real battle had just begun. Greg wouldn't take this lying down. His empire was crumbling, and Ethan knew that Greg would do anything to stop him now. The phone rang, and Ethan's stomach dropped when he saw the caller ID. It was from Maya's school. "Mr. Parker, we have a situation." Ethan's heart raced as he listened to the principal's voice crackling through the phone. "Mr. Parker, there's been an incident. Maya was approached by someone at school today. We're not sure who it was, but they were asking about your family and the news coverage." Ethan's mind went into overdrive. "What happened exactly?" he demanded, his voice sharp. The person seemed harmless at first, just asking questions. But when Maya refused to answer, they started to get more insistent. Thankfully, another teacher intervened before it escalated. Ethan stood up, pacing back and forth. "Is Maya okay?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "Yes, she's fine. We've spoken to her, and we've informed the authorities. But I thought you should know. I'm just worried about the attention the story is attracting." Ethan's mind was already planning the next steps. He couldn't risk any more threats to his family. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said, hanging up the phone. As he rushed out of the house, he checked the locks and double-checked the security system. The walls were closing in. They had no idea who was behind the threat, but he knew Greg wouldn't hesitate to use any means necessary to intimidate him. When he arrived at the school, Maya was in the principal's office, looking shaken but otherwise unharmed. Ethan knelt down in front of her. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm fine, Dad, but I'm scared." Ethan hugged her tightly, his resolve solidifying. "I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." The following days were filled with a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, news outlets, and the police. Ethan's home became a fortress of locked doors, security cameras, and constant vigilance. He knew that Greg's retaliation would be relentless, but now the stakes were too high to back down. The police had begun an investigation into the incident at Maya's school, but Ethan could tell they were struggling to find solid leads. The person who had approached Maya was a ghost. No identification, no way to trace them back to Greg. Whoever was behind the threats had taken every precaution. That afternoon, Ethan received an unsettling message. "You've made a mistake. Stop now, or your family will pay the price." Ethan's hand shook as he read the words. The threats were escalating, and he could feel the pressure building. But something inside him refused to give in. Maya and Sophie were counting on him, and he couldn't let fear dictate their future. Sitting at his desk, Ethan scanned through the documents once again. The evidence was irrefutable. Greg Thompson had built an empire on lies, manipulation, and human trafficking. If he backed down now, the lives of countless innocent children would remain in jeopardy. Ethan knew what he had to do. He couldn't stop now. The only way to bring Greg to justice was to keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. The following evening, Ethan was alone in his study, reviewing the final pieces of evidence that would bring down Greg Thompson. He could feel the weight of his choices pressing on him. Every decision had led him to this point. The threats, the danger, the sleepless nights, it had all built up to this one moment. Suddenly, a knock on the door broke his concentration. He was startled. No one had come by unexpectedly in days. He stood up, heart pounding, and cautiously approached the door. When he opened it, standing there was Rachel, the former nurse who had once worked at St. Mary's. She looked frantic, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Rachel?" Ethan asked, shocked to see her. "What's going on? Are you okay?" Rachel stepped inside quickly, looking over her shoulder as though someone might be watching. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "They know I helped you. They're coming for me." Ethan's heart sank. "Who?" "Greg's people," she whispered urgently. "I've already gotten 2 visits. People threatening me. They told me if I didn't stay quiet, I'd regret it." She swallowed hard. "They know everything I told you. They know I'm involved in this." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe here. They won't hurt you." Rachel shook her head. "I don't think it's that simple. They'll go after you next, and after Maya and Sophie." Ethan clenched his jaw. The stakes had just gone higher. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting for their survival. The days following Rachel's visit were tense. Ethan knew they had to move quickly. Greg's people were making their move, and the walls were closing in faster than he had anticipated. Rachel stayed with Ethan and his family, but her presence only made him more aware of the growing danger. He couldn't risk losing another ally. He contacted the journalist who had helped expose the story. "We need to go further," Ethan said, his voice firm. "This has to go national. We need more pressure on Greg. More people asking questions. I'm not just doing this for Maya anymore. I'm doing it for Rachel, for everyone he's hurt." The journalist agreed, and within hours, the story went viral. News outlets across the country began reporting on the scandal, urging authorities to act. The pressure on Greg intensified, but Ethan knew it wasn't enough. He still had to expose the full extent of the operation and put an end to it for good. That evening, Maya and Sophie were in the living room, playing together as usual. Ethan watched them from the hallway, his heart aching with the realization that their world was about to change forever. No matter what happened, he had to protect them. As the night wore on, Ethan sat with Rachel in the kitchen, the weight of their fight settling over them. "We're almost there," he said, more to reassure himself than anyone else. Rachel nodded, but the fear in her eyes was impossible to ignore. "Just be careful. Greg will stop at nothing." The following morning, Ethan received a call from Karen. "We've got them," she said, her voice steady but filled with excitement. "I managed to track down Greg's connection to the adoption rings. His financial dealings with several high-profile clients have been documented. We have the smoking gun." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Is it enough to bring him down?" "It's more than enough," Karen replied. "This is the evidence we need to put him behind bars for good, but we'll need to move fast. If we give him time to cover his tracks, he'll slip away again." Ethan glanced over at Rachel, who was sitting at the kitchen table, quietly watching the conversation unfold. She had been helping him with every step of this journey, and now, with the evidence in hand, he was ready to strike. "Let's go public," Ethan said decisively. "We can't waste another second. If we expose this now, Greg will have no choice but to face the consequences." Karen agreed, and within hours, a new expose hit the news. The details of Greg Thompson's illegal adoption ring, the money laundering schemes, and the powerful people involved were laid bare for the world to see. As the story spread, law enforcement began their own investigations, but Ethan knew Greg wouldn't go down without a fight. That night, as Ethan sat alone in his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The truth had been exposed, but the final confrontation was still ahead. He couldn't rest until Greg was brought to justice. By morning, the world had already changed. News of Greg Thompson's involvement in the adoption scandal had taken over the media. Law enforcement was mobilized, and warrants were issued for his arrest. But Ethan knew the battle wasn't won yet. Greg had powerful allies, and those allies wouldn't let him fall without a fight. Ethan kept the phone by his side, waiting for the inevitable backlash. But as the hours passed, there was nothing. No calls from Greg's legal team, no threats, no retaliation. The silence was almost worse than the chaos. It felt like the calm before the storm. Then, around noon, Ethan's phone buzzed with a new notification. The headline read, "Greg Thompson arrested for human trafficking and corruption." Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he read the details. Greg had been apprehended at a safe house in the city. His accomplices had turned on him, and the weight of the evidence had been too much to overcome. Rachel, standing nearby, read the news with a heavy sigh of relief. "It's over," she whispered. Ethan nodded, feeling a mix of triumph and exhaustion. "It's over," he repeated, but in the back of his mind, he knew this was only the first step. The victims of the adoption ring, Maya, Sophie, and so many others, would now have a chance to rebuild their lives. As the day wore on, Ethan gathered his family together. Sophie and Maya, still blissfully unaware of the dangers they had faced, were safe. And for the first time in weeks, Ethan allowed himself to relax, knowing that the fight was finally over. But as he looked at the two girls, he realized that his fight wasn't just about justice. It was about giving them the life they deserved. The truth had set them free, and now they could begin again. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.